Welcome to Silent Secrets. I'm your host for tonight's mystery. Today's tale begins with a quiet moment, a simple knock, a forgotten letter, and a truth that was never meant to be discovered. But one hidden secret, buried in the shadows, will turn an ordinary day into a night no one will ever forget. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Silent Secrets and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love seeing how far these mysteries travel. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's uncover tonight's silent secret. Chapter 1. Fey Winter Lights in Alderwick Square. It was in that season when daylight seems an economy, and the night arrives early, confidently, as though it has always owned the streets, that we found ourselves in Alderwick. The town had the air of a place that took pride in small things done well. Neat brick, facades, windows polished to a bright honesty, and a central square that seemed designed for a postcard rather than the muddle of real life. The Christmas Market in Alderwick Square had been raised like a little city within the town. Rows of wooden stalls shingled with frost, strings of lanterns swinging gently in the wind, and wreaths that gave off a sharp scent of pine and spice. There were chestnuts, roasting in iron pans, their skins popping with tiny reports. There was mulled cider steaming in copper urns. There were children with red noses and mittens too large for their hands, tugging at their mothers toward sugared almonds and carved toys. And yet, how shall I put it? There was something restrained in the merriment, a carefulness. The people smiled and spoke in bright voices, but they did so as one might speak near a sleeping invalid. Even the laughter, when it came, seemed to fall quickly into quiet, like a song cut short. Poirot, of course, noticed it at once. He asked, tilting his head so that the brim of his hat caught the lantern. Light, his eyes, always so alive to the world, moved from face to face with that polite detachment which never, however, missed a single detail. "Feel what?" I said. Because I confess my own spirits had risen at the sight of the market, I have always liked the cheer of these seasonal affairs, particularly when one can enjoy them without being responsible for them. It's delightful, positively Dickensian. Poirot gave a small sound, half amused, half reproachful. The lanterns, the singing, the smell of the spices, all that is charming, but underneath, there is the thin layer of ice. I stared at him, half expecting him to point to some literal patch of frozen water. Ice. It's cold, certainly. Not that. He made a tiny gesture, as though brushing flour from his sleeve. The cold in the mines, the caution, the eyes that look away. I began to protest that he imagined things. But it was at that moment that the man known as Lionel Barrett came striding across the square, and even my cheerful mood faltered just a touch. Barrett was the sort of figure one expects to see on committees, at church bazaars, and in photographs of local benefactors, broad-shouldered, well-fed without being truly stout, and dressed in a coat that was expensive in a way that did not shout. His hair was iron-grey, brushed back carefully, and his cheeks were bright with cold or with the remains of some indoor conviviality. He had a voice that carried, a big, hearty sound that announced goodwill and confidence. "Mrs. Phelps, there you are. Splendid stall, splendid. And you, Mr. Dunn, your pies are the pride of Alderwick, my boy. Keep them coming, keep them coming." He laughed loudly at something a vendor said, and clapped the man on the shoulder with an air of robust camaraderie. It was an ordinary scene, and yet Poirot's gaze sharpened. I saw it then. The vendor, Dunn, I supposed, laughed too, but it was a laugh that failed to reach his eyes. His smile held an odd stiffness, like a mask that had been worn too long, and when Barrett moved on, the man's shoulders, those same shoulders that had been clapped in friendly fashion, seemed to sag with relief. Poirot leaned slightly toward me. "You see," I could not deny it. "Perhaps they're simply intimidated. Barrett appears rather energetic." "Energy is one thing," said Poirot quietly. "Pressure is another. Look there." He inclined his head toward a stall where a young woman was arranging candles. They were prettily made, some flecked with gold, some tinted pale green, and their wax caught the lantern, light as though they held the glow inside them. The young woman's hands moved neatly, but I noticed that when Barrett's shadow crossed the stall, her fingers hesitated. Barrett stopped at her counter, smiling broadly. "Miss Larkin, excellent, excellent. Candles are always needed in the winter. People like a little light. Yes, the good town must shine." "Of course," said Miss Larkin. Her voice was polite. Too polite. She did not look at him directly. Her gaze settled on the candle, wicks, the coins in her till, anything but his face. "And how goes the collection for the widow's fund? I trust you are doing your part." "We are." "Yes," she said quickly. "We are all doing our part." Barrett's laugh came again, booming. Full yet, I thought, just for an instant, that it sounded strained, as though the laughter were being dragged out of him by force, rather than rising naturally. He leaned forward, still smiling, and said something in a lower tone that I could not catch. Miss Larkin's face tightened. Then she nodded. "Splendid," said Barrett, straightening. "Splendid. That is the Alderwick spirit." He moved on, and Miss Larkin's breath came out in a small, visible cloud, like a sigh she had been holding. Poirot watched her for a moment, then turned his attention back to Barrett. "A man who organizes the charity," he murmured. "And yet he must remind them, he must insist, he must intimidate." I frowned. "Surely you're not suggesting he's a villain? The whole town says he funds their winter relief." "The whole town says many things," Poirot replied, "and the whole town avoids meeting his eyes." As we walked, we passed groups of townsfolk, respectable men with scarves tucked neatly into their coats, women with baskets on their arms, children with sticky fingers. They called greetings to one another, but I noticed more than one conversation falter as Barrett passed. A woman's hand tightened on her husband's sleeve. A boy who had been laughing suddenly became quiet, looking down at his boots. The market had a central attraction, a tall tree decorated with lanterns and ribbons, and beneath it a wooden platform where a small choir of schoolchildren sang carols. Their high voices rose and fell in the frosty air, and for a moment the square seemed genuinely joyful. Barrett stopped near the tree, turning so that the lantern light shone on his face. He raised a hand to wave at someone, and again that loud laugh rang out. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Observe his mouth," he said. "It smiles, but the muscles here—" He tapped lightly at his own cheek. "They are tight. He is performing happiness." "Perhaps he's tired," I said, still clinging to ordinary explanations. "A market is a great undertaking." Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he drifted nearer to a stall selling knitted goods, where an older woman sat with her hands folded in her lap. A sign read, "For the Orphan's Hearth. All proceeds to winter relief." Poirot addressed her with his usual courtesy. "Madam, your work is very fine. The stitches are even. It is the hand of patience." The woman looked up, startled into gratitude. "Thank you, sir," Poirot selected a pair of gloves, paid, and then, so delicately, so naturally that it seemed merely conversation, he asked, "And this market, it is very successful?" "Yes, it must be satisfying to work for such a generous cause." Her smile faltered. "Yes," she said, "very satisfying." Poirot waited. His face remained pleasant, but his eyes were attentive. The woman's gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Barrett near the tree. Then she lowered her eyes again. "Mr. Barrett does much for the town," she added, and there was something in her tone that made it less a statement of gratitude than a recited fact. Poirot nodded gravely. "It is fortunate, when a town has such a man." She swallowed. "Yes, fortunate." Poirot thanked her and moved away. When we had gone a little distance, I asked him what he had learnt. "That she is afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of Barrett?" Poirot gave me a sidelong look. "Hastings, when you walk through a market and you smell cinnamon, you say, 'Ah, cinnamon.' When you walk through a room and you smell smoke, you do not say, 'Ah, it is nothing.' You say, 'Where is the fire?' Fear is like smoke. It comes from somewhere. We were standing then, near a stall selling carved wooden ornaments, little birds and stars and miniature sleighs. The artisan, a thin man with sharp features, had been chatting with a customer. When he saw Poirot, his eyes became wary. He nodded briefly, but his body angled away, as though he wished to end the encounter quickly. Barrett, meanwhile, had begun addressing the crowd from the platform beneath the tree. He climbed up with ease, lifting his arms as though embracing the whole square. "My friends," he called. "What a night! What a sight! Look at this! Look at Alderwick shining like a beacon against the winter. This market is not only a delight, it is a duty. We are here to warm those who have no fire, to feed those who have no bread, to remind ourselves that prosperity means nothing unless it is shared." There was applause. Polite. Certainly genuine. Not entirely, I thought. People clapped because clapping was expected. They cheered because a cheer was required. Their eyes were on him, yes, but not with admiration so much as with the watchfulness. "One gives a man who holds power over one's comfort," Barrett continued, voice ringing, "and I tell you this, every coin matters. Every pledge must be honored, every promise kept. Alderwick is better than the towns that forget their own. We do not forget, we do not fail." As he spoke those last words, his gaze swept the crowd. It was then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Barrett's eyes, bright under the lanterns, seemed to linger on certain faces with a particular emphasis, like a schoolmaster taking note of pupils. Poirot saw it too. His expression remained mild, but a faint line appeared between his brows. Barrett laughed again, too loud, and stepped down amid applause. He was greeted by a few men who shook his hand and praised him. He accepted it all with easy confidence. Then his eyes fell upon Poirot and me for the briefest moment. His smile wavered. It was as though he had expected to see only familiar faces, and the presence of strangers, particularly a man whose composure suggested intelligence, had unsettled him. But he recovered quickly, striding toward us with hand outstretched. "Good evening," he boomed. "I don't believe we've met. Welcome to Alderwick. I'm Lionel Barrett, and you are—" "Hercule Poirot," said Poirot. Barrett's hand paused in mid-air for a fraction of a second. It was very slight, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. Poirot saw it. "Poirot," repeated Barrett, with a laugh that did not sound like laughter. "Ah, the detective. Well, well, we are honored." Poirot shook his hand, his expression courteous. "You are very kind, monsieur." He stopped himself, as though choosing words carefully. "Mr. Barrett, your market is most beautiful." Barrett's eyes sharpened at that tiny hesitation, though I doubt anyone else would have noticed. "We do our best," he said. "Alderwick is a good town." "A good town," Poirot agreed gently, "but perhaps a town under strain." Barrett's smile did not vanish, but it became thinner. "Strain? Nonsense. It is winter. Winter strains everyone." "Indeed," said Poirot. "And yet, some strains are caused by the weather, others by men." Barrett's laugh burst out again, louder than before, and several people nearby turned their heads. "You have the famous way with words, Mr. Poirot," he said, and there was a note in his tone that was not quite admiration. "But I assure you, there is no mystery here, only charity." Poirot's eyes were mild. "Charity can hide many things," he said. For a moment, Barrett's gaze held Poirot's, and I felt, absurdly, that the lanterns around us burned a little colder. Then Barrett's genial manner snapped back into place like a cloak drawn up against the wind. "Well, you must both come to the hall tomorrow evening," he said. "We have a small gathering after the market closes. Refreshments, music, nothing elaborate. But it would please the town, and it would please me." "I thank you," said Poirot. "Perhaps we shall." Barrett nodded, and then, before he turned away, he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that only we could hear. "You'll find Alderwick very straightforward," he said. "We don't care for outsiders stirring up questions." Then he stepped back, smiling broadly again, and moved away into the crowd like a man who believed the square belonged to him. Hastings, the soldier in me, bristled at the implied threat. "Well," I exclaimed, "that fellow is a piece of work. Who does he think he is?" Poirot did not share my indignation. He watched Barrett's retreating back with thoughtful calm. "He thinks he is safe," said Poirot. "And when a man thinks himself safe, Hastings, he becomes careless. He forgets that the truth, like the frost, creeps into every crack." The choir continued singing. The lanterns swayed. A child squealed with delight at a spinning wooden top. Life on the surface carried on in its festive manner. Yet, I could not shake the feeling that Poirot had named correctly. Beneath the fresh snow of Christmas cheer, something hard and dangerous was forming. Silent, unseen, waiting. And in the center of it, all moved Lionel Barrett, laughing too loudly, smiling too tightly, and collecting promises with the air of a man who did not accept refusal. Poirot tucked the gloves we had bought into his pocket, as though they were evidence. His gaze swept the market one more time, taking in the averted eyes, the stiff politeness, the small flinches. "Yes," he said softly, "there is unease, and where there is unease, there is almost always the seed of a crime." He glanced at me then, and for the first time that evening there was something like sorrow in his expression, quickly hidden but unmistakable. "In winter," he added, "the lights are very pretty, but the darkness is close." Chapter 2. Fey collapse by the mulled wine stall. The church clock in Alderwick had a voice of its own, deep, deliberate, and faintly admonishing, as though it reminded the town each hour that time was passing and obligations remained. When it began to strike 8, the sound rolled over the square and seemed to gather the crowd in a single instinctive movement. Lanterns glowed brighter as the sky darkened. The wind cut through scarves and collars, driving people closer to the stalls where heat and light pooled in little inviting islands. At the mulled wine stand, one of the busiest in the market, a copper urn hissed and breathed out steam that carried cinnamon, clove, and orange peel into the cold air. The proprietor, a ruddy-faced man with a moustache that shone with damp, poured continuously, his hands working like a machine. Barrett appeared again, as if summoned by the clock itself. He had been moving about the market all evening with the same hearty energy, shaking hands, praising stalls, calling people by name in a way that implied both affection and ownership. Yet now, as he approached the mulled wine stall, his movements were fractionally less assured. He walked too quickly, perhaps, or perhaps he walked like a man who had been forcing himself to continue. Poirot and I were near the tree when Barrett mounted a small step, stool set beside the stall, an improvised platform. No doubt placed there precisely because he liked to address people from a little higher than themselves. "Friends," he called, raising his voice above the bustle. "A moment, only a moment." A ripple ran through the crowd. Heads turned. People edged closer. There is something in human nature that compels one to watch a man who believes he is important. Barrett took a mug from the vendor, the dark liquid steaming against his gloves. He lifted it in salute, lantern, light flickering in the surface of the wine. "To Alderwick," he boomed. "To good hearts and open hands, to winter charity, and to those who make it possible." There was applause, some cheer. And then, just as he tipped the mug slightly, as though he meant to drink, and then continue speaking, his face altered. It was a swift change, but unmistakable. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving them mottled and gray beneath the lanterns. His eyes widened, not theatrically, as if he wished to impress, but with genuine surprise, as though something inside him had betrayed him. The mug wavered. For an absurd instant, I thought he had merely lost his footing. Then his shoulders jerked, like a man struck by an invisible blow. He staggered forward, his knee knocking the wooden counter with a dull thud. The mug slipped from his grasp and fell, spilling steaming wine that hissed as it hit the cold boards and ran in dark rivulets to the ground. Barrett's mouth opened as though he meant to speak, but no words came. He made a thick, choking sound. His hands clawed at the air, not for help but for balance, and then his body folded in on itself. He collapsed sideways against the counter, dragging a string of garland down with him, and slid heavily to the ground. For a heartbeat, the square seemed to hold its breath. Then sound rushed back in a flood. A woman screamed. Someone shouted, "Fetch a doctor!" The mulled wine vendor leaned over the counter, eyes bulging. People pressed forward, then recoiled, then pressed again. The neat order of the market dissolved into a confused ring of faces and murmurs. I, with my soldier's instincts, pushed toward the fallen man at once. It seemed impossible that Barrett, so loud, so vigorous, could be lying there like a sack of discarded clothes. His coat had come open, and the white of his shirt front showed starkly beneath his chin. His head had struck the wooden leg of the counter. A small smear of blood was already appearing near his hairline. "Stand back," I said sharply, but my voice was swallowed by the noise. Poirot was beside me, not jostling, not pushing, but somehow arriving exactly where he wished to be. His eyes were fixed on Barrett, but I noticed, oddly enough, that he was also watching everything around Barrett. The spilled wine, the fallen garland, the mugs on the counter, the vendors' hands, the faces of those nearest. A young man in a tweed cap dropped to his knees. "Mr. Barrett," he cried. "Sir, can you hear me?" Poirot touched the man lightly on the shoulder. "Do not shake him," he said very calmly. "It will do no good." "Are you a doctor?" demanded the young man, his voice cracked with panic. "No," said Poirot, "but I have seen enough of death." That word, death, moved through the crowd like a cold gust. People drew back slightly, as though space itself might protect them. The vendor stammered, He was just toasting. Poirot crouched with surprising ease for a man of his build. He did not touch Barrett immediately. Instead, he leaned close, listening, watching. Then he placed 2 fingers gently against Barrett's wrist. For a long second he did not move. Then he looked up at me. "It is finished," he said quietly. I felt my stomach drop. "Dead?" I asked. Though the question was ridiculous, one could see it. Barrett's face had already begun to settle into that strange stillness that is unlike any sleep. Poirot gave a small nod. "Good God," I muttered. The crowd surged again, as if refusing to accept the finality of it. Someone pushed past me, a woman with a shawl pulled over her head. She knelt, staring at Barrett's face with wide, horrified eyes. "It can't know, Lionel." A man caught her by the arms and hauled her back. "Mrs. Barrett, for heaven's sake, don't." So the woman was his wife. She looked dazed, as though she had stepped suddenly into a world with different rules. Poirot rose, wiping his fingers discreetly with his handkerchief. His expression was grave, but not shocked. Poirot did not waste emotion on surprise. He reserved it for understanding. The mulled wine still steamed on the ground. As people shifted and stamped their feet in agitation, they trod through it, smearing it darkly across the planks. And yet, Poirot's gaze remained fixed on that spill, as though it were a clue written plainly for anyone with the sense to read it. He bent slightly, inhaling. I saw his nostrils flare. Just once, his eyes sharpened. "What is it?" I asked, low, leaning closer. "The scent," he said. "It is wrong." I sniffed myself and caught only what I expected. Spice, wine, the sweetness of almonds from the neighboring stall where sugared nuts were being scooped into paper cones. Wrong how? Poirot's attention darted briefly to the almond stall. A girl was standing there. Miss Larkin, I recognized. Though she was not selling candles now, she held a tray of nuts. Her face pale, her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but could not. Her eyes were fixed on Barrett's body with an expression I could not name. Fear certainly, but something else too, relief. Horror, both, perhaps in a confusing mixture. Poirot looked back at the spilled wine. "There is something sharp beneath the spice," he murmured. "Something that does not belong." Before I could press him further, a voice called out from the crowd. "Make way! "Make way!" A man in a dark overcoat forced his way through, followed by a constable who looked flustered and young. The man's face was pinched, his mouth set in a line that suggested he did not enjoy being summoned to public disorder. He carried himself with the stiff authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Inspector Reed," muttered someone near me. Inspector Reed knelt beside Barrett, without preamble, his gloved hands efficient. He checked the pulse, lifted an eyelid, then straightened, his face hardening. "Who was with him?" he demanded. The vendor spluttered. "He came. He asked for a mug, same as always." "Same as always?" Reed snapped. "Yes, sir. He takes it hot, extra orange peel." Poirot's eyes flickered. "Extra orange peel," he repeated softly, as if storing the detail carefully. Reed looked around at the crushed ring of faces. "Nobody touches anything," he said loudly. "This market is closed. Constable, call for the doctor and the undertaker, and send word to the station, now." A groan rose from the crowd, part protest, part shock. The idea of the market closing felt, to the townsfolk, like the end of the world as they knew it. It was as if Barrett's collapse had broken not only a man but the illusion of safety itself. Poirot stepped forward a little. "Inspector Reed," he said. Reed turned sharply. "And you are Hercule Poirot?" There was the slightest pause, the same hesitation Barrett had shown earlier, but different in nature, recognition, perhaps, and unwilling respect. "The detective," said Reed curtly. "What are you doing here?" "Enjoying the lights," said Poirot mildly. "And observing, as is my habit." Reed's eyes narrowed, then observed from a distance. "This is police business." Poirot did not bristle. He never did. He merely inclined his head. "Of course, but I tell you one thing now. This death is not so simple as it appears." Reed snorted. "It looks simple enough, man collapses. Winter heart." Poirot's gaze slid to the spilled wine again, then to the fallen mug, now lying on its side, like a discarded instrument. "Perhaps," he said. "And perhaps not, you see, Inspector. I am very sensitive to certain small details." Reed's patience was visibly thin. "If you have something concrete, speak. If not, step aside." Poirot did not argue. He moved away, but not far, just enough to satisfy the inspector's sense of authority while still keeping the scene within his view. He took my arm and drew me toward the edge of the crowd where we could stand without being pressed. Mrs. Barrett had been guided to a bench near the tree. She sat rigidly, hands clenched in her lap. A woman with a knitted shawl hovered beside her, murmuring incoherent comfort. Yet Mrs. Barrett's eyes remained fixed on the place where her husband had fallen, as though she could not accept that the world would continue with him absent. Poirot watched her, his face unreadable. Nearby, I saw the thin artisan from the carved ornament stall. He stood a little apart, his jaw tight, his hands clenched so hard the knuckles showed white. When his eyes met Poirot's, he looked away quickly. There were other faces too. Faces that did not look purely shocked. A middle-aged man in a clerk's coat, lips pressed tight in what might have been suppressed satisfaction. A young woman, Miss Larkin again, whose shoulders trembled as if she fought to hold herself together. An older gentleman with spectacles who looked not horrified, but calculating. "Poirot," I murmured, uneasy. "Surely you don't think—" Poirot held up a finger, silencing me gently. His gaze had returned once more to the wine stall. The vendor was wringing his hands. "It's madness," he kept saying. "Madness. He only had what he always has." Poirot's eyes moved to the copper urn, to the row of mugs, to the ladle. He watched the vendor's movements as one might watch the hands of a magician, knowing that the secret is often in what appears ordinary. Then, quite suddenly, Poirot stepped forward again, not to confront Inspector Reed, but to speak to the vendor in a low voice. "My friend," he said, "tell me, when Mr. Barrett came to you this evening, did anyone else touch his mug?" The vendor blinked, confused. "Touch it? No. Why would they?" I poured. He took it. Poirot nodded slowly. "And the orange peel? You add it yourself?" "Yes, of course. Always he likes it." Poirot's eyes flicked toward the orange slices laid out on a plate. They shone wetly in the lantern light. "Did anyone else bring him a drink earlier?" Poirot asked. The vendor hesitated. His eyes darted to the crowd, then back. There was the committee table near the tree. Sometimes they serve." Poirot did not press further. He thanked the man and returned to my side. "What are you thinking?" I demanded. Poirot's face was very calm, but his voice had a low intensity. "I am thinking," he said, "that a man does not give a public toast, in the full view of everyone, and then die by accident, unless fate has a very theatrical sense." "You mean poison?" Poirot's eyes remained on the steaming stain of spilled wine, now cooling into darkness on the boards. "It is possible," he said, "and if it is poison, then the murderer has chosen a bold method, a public stage, a performance." He paused, and the lantern. Light caught his eyes, making them seem almost reflective. "But remember, Hastings, boldness can be arrogance, or it can be desperation." The church clock had finished striking. The choir had fallen silent. The lantern still swung gently, but the market no longer felt like a place of celebration. It had become, in the space of moments, a crime scene filled with murmurs, suspicion, and the cold realization that someone in that cheerful crowd might have raised a hand toward murder. Inspector Reed's voice cut through the air again, barking orders. The constable hurried off. People began to drift reluctantly away, glancing back over their shoulders, as though the sight of Barrett's body might follow them home. Poirot remained still, watching, absorbing, and I realized then what had changed most of all. The unease Poirot had sensed earlier, the thin ice beneath the snow, had cracked open, and beneath it something dark and deep was revealed. Barrett was dead, and Alderwick Square, for all its lanterns, had never looked so cold. Chapter 3 Fay the Market sealed. The first consequence of sudden death is always disorder. The second is authority. Within minutes of Lionel Barrett's collapse, the bright little market that had seemed so carefully arranged for pleasure was transformed into a cramped arena of impatience, anxiety, and muttered conjecture. Lanterns still swung above the stalls, and the garlands still glittered with frost. But the air had changed. It had the sharpness of a room after bad news, a place where people speak too loudly and breathe too shallowly. Inspector Reed, brisk and irritable, had done what a capable man does when confronted with chaos. He imposed rules. He stationed constables at the entrances to the square, ordered the crowd back, and told the vendors they were not to touch so much as a string of ribbon until permitted. His voice carried, and his manner suggested that anyone who argued would be treated as an obstacle rather than a citizen. Naturally, people argued. "My stall, my stock. Do you expect me to leave it here all night?" demanded the pie. Seller, Mr. Dunn, his face blotched with anger and fear. "You will leave it," Reed snapped, "or you'll answer questions at the station instead of at your counter." A chorus rose, complaints about perishables, about money, about the indignity of being treated like criminals. But Reed did not soften. I saw, too, that the vendors' protests were not entirely sincere. Beneath the irritation there ran something else, apprehension. They were angry at being detained, certainly, but they were also uneasy at remaining, as though the square itself had become dangerous. Poirot stood a little apart, hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching as though the entire scene were a stage, and he alone had the script. He did not press forward. He never thrust himself. Yet his gaze missed nothing. It was perhaps 20 minutes after the collapse that a new figure entered the square, and the atmosphere altered again. Authority arriving in a more deliberate form. This man was older than Reed, broader through the shoulders, and carried his weight with the habit of command. He wore a long coat with the collar turned up, and his hat was dusted with a fine film of frost. His face, lined but firm, had the composed expression of a man who had seen many crises and found that very few were improved by haste. Inspector Reed straightened, as though drawn by a string. "Sir," he said. The older man nodded once. Reed, then his eyes moved to the body, still lying where it had fallen, now respectfully screened from the crowd by a makeshift barrier of crates and cloth. He spoke quietly, but his voice had the effect of stilling those around him. "Inspector Hawthorne," someone murmured near me, as if naming him carried weight. Hawthorne knelt, examined Barrett with an economy of motion, and then rose. His gaze swept the market, stall by stall, face by face, taking in the lanterns, the steaming urn, the scattered mugs. "This square remains closed," he said. "No one leaves until I am satisfied." A groan rose, but it was weaker now. Hawthorne's authority was not the noisy kind that provoked resistance. It was the quiet kind that made resistance feel futile. Reed leaned in. "I thought heart failure, sir. He was known to drink, but—" His eyes flicked to the spilled wine. Mr. Poirot suggested it might not be so simple. At the mention of Poirot's name, Hawthorne's gaze shifted, fast and assessing, until it found Poirot standing near the tree, composed as ever. "You," said Hawthorne, crossing the square with measured steps. "Hercule Poirot." Poirot inclined his head. "Inspector Hawthorne, I am sorry to meet you in such circumstances." Hawthorne's mouth tightened slightly, as though he found courtesy in a crime scene inconvenient, but could not deny its effectiveness. "I didn't expect to find you here." "One does not expect death," Poirot replied. "And yet it arrives." Hawthorne studied him for a moment longer, then turned his attention back to the wine stall. "What is your impression?" Poirot's eyes drifted toward the copper urn. "That the death is arranged. If it's murder, it's poison. And poison in the wine barrel seems the only way." Poirot's expression remained mild. "Then let us look at the barrel." Hawthorne gestured, and two constables cleared the space. The mulled wine vendor, still trembling, was brought forward. "It wasn't me," he blurted at once. "I swear it, Mr. Barrett. He was always good to me." Hawthorne held up a hand. "We will decide what you are later. For now you will answer questions." The copper urn was moved aside, revealing a smaller wooden barrel beneath, its lid fastened. The vendor explained in a rush how the wine was heated above and replenished from below. Hawthorne listened, then ordered the lid opened. A constable prized it up. The scent of spiced wine rose immediately, warm and ordinary. Hawthorne took a ladle and poured into a clean cup. Reed sniffed, grimacing at the strong spice. Then, at Hawthorne's instruction, the constable carried the cup to a doctor who had now arrived, an anxious man with a leather bag and cold, reddened hands. The doctor sniffed, tasted the tiniest drop, and shook his head. "Nothing odd in the barrel," he said. "Strong, yes, but no bitterness, no chemical tang. If you suspect poison, it's not in there." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Taste is not proof." "Then send it to the laboratory," said Poirot quietly. "But I agree, this is not the source." Reed looked annoyed. "If it's not in the barrel, how?" "How?" Poirot repeated gently. "By being added to one mug only." Hawthorne glanced at the vendor. "Was the mug prepared here?" "Yes," the vendor insisted. "I poured it myself. Same as always." Poirot stepped forward, his gaze on the row of mugs. "And the orange peel, you add it last?" "Yes, always." Poirot examined the plate of orange slices, then his eyes lifted to the neighboring almond stall, where paper cones and sugar, dusted nuts sat in inviting heaps. "You see," said Poirot, more to Hawthorne than to Reed, "if one wished the death to appear natural, hot, cold, indulgence, one chooses the public toast. One chooses a drink that is already dark, already spiced, and one adds the poison not to the barrel, which would kill others, but to the single cup." Reed frowned. "But in plain sight." Poirot's shoulders rose a fraction. "In plain sight there is much blindness. People see what they expect." Hawthorne's gaze returned to Barrett's body. "Bring the mug he held," he ordered. The fallen mug had been retrieved from the ground and set on a cloth. Hawthorne did not touch it with bare hands. He directed a constable to lift it carefully, and they carried it nearer. Poirot leaned in, not touching, only observing. His eyes traveled over the handle, the rim, the interior stained with wine. Then he said very softly, "Ah, what?" I asked. But he did not answer me. He was looking at Barrett's right glove, which had been removed and placed beside the body. Hawthorne noticed the direction of his gaze. "What do you see?" Poirot pointed. "Not dramatically, but with precise care." "There, on the glove." Hawthorne bent closer. Reed did too. "At first I saw nothing. Then, as the lantern light caught the surface of the leather, a faint sparkle appeared, teeny grains like frost that had chosen only one place to settle." "Sugar," Reed said, startled. "Sugar crystals." Poirot agreed. "Not many, but enough." Hawthorne's face remained still, though his eyes sharpened, "from the almonds, from the sweets." "Possibly," said Poirot, "or from something else, something that carries sugar as a disguise." He turned his attention back to the mug handle. "And here, do you observe this smear?" Reed squinted. "It's just dirt." Poirot shook his head. "Not dirt. Wax." Hawthorne leaned nearer. The smear was thin, almost imperceptible, like a careless brush of color. Yet under the lantern it showed unmistakably as red, the same tone as the wax candles Miss Larkin had displayed earlier in the evening. "Wax on a mug," Reed said, incredulous. "On the handle," Poirot corrected, "where the fingers would grip." Hawthorne straightened slowly. "How does wax get there?" Poirot's voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it. "When someone holds a candle too close, when someone seals something, or when someone handles wax and then touches the mug." Reed scoffed. "You can't build a case on a smudge." "No," Poirot agreed. "But one does not build a case on a single brick. One builds it on many, placed with order." He looked again at the sugar crystals on the glove. "Mr. Barrett," Poirot continued, "was a man who liked to present an image. He liked to be seen. He liked to toast, to laugh, to insist. This death, public, dramatic, suggests a desire not only to kill, but to shape what others believe about the killing." Hawthorne watched him. "You think the murderer wanted it to look like misfortune?" "Yes," said Poirot. "A tragic indulgence, the hearty man who drinks too much mulled wine in the cold and collapses. The moral, even the strong may fall. It is neat, it is convenient, and it discourages questions, unless one notices what does not belong." Reed crossed his arms. "And the wax and sugar are what don't belong." "They are what whisper," Poirot replied. "They do not shout, but I listen to whispers." Hawthorne's gaze moved across the square again. "Who had access to the mug?" "The vendor," Reed said, "Agnon near enough to the stall." "And who knew," Poirot added, "that Mr. Barrett would demand his extra orange peel, that he would make a toast at 8, that he would choose this stall at this moment?" Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Someone close to him." Poirot nodded, "or someone who watched him very carefully." A gust of wind swept through the square, making the lantern swing and sending a ripple through the crowd. I saw faces turned inward. Conversation stopped abruptly, eyes darting. The festive decorations now seemed like irony, bright ribbons fluttering over a corpse. Hawthorne spoke briskly to Reed. "Take statements from every vendor, nobody leaves. The barrel and the mug go to the station, and find out who last handled Mr. Barrett's gloves." Reed nodded, already moving. Poirot remained by the body for another moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then, very quietly, he said to me, "You remember Hastings, how he told us this town did not like outsiders stirring questions?" "Yes." Poirot looked toward the crowd, where Mrs. Barrett sat rigid on the bench, and where Miss Larkin stood near the almonds with trembling hands. "Now the questions will stir themselves," he said, "and those who thought themselves safe will discover that safety is a delicate thing. Like sugar on a glove, one touch, and it is gone." As Hawthorne's men began methodically sealing the square ropes drawn, entrances guarded, the market truly became what Poirot had sensed all along, not a celebration, but a place of strain, held together by bright lights and forced smiles, until one sharp act split it open. Somewhere among the stalls, someone had prepared carefully, and someone had wanted Lionel Barrett's death to look like nothing more than a tragic moment of winter cheer. Chapter 4: Fey Merchants and Motives. By the time Inspector Hawthorne began his inquiries in earnest, the Christmas market no longer resembled a place of commerce at all. It had become a corridor of suspicion. The stalls stood silent and half-lit, their goods untouched, their owners gathered in small, uneasy knots under the watchful eyes of constables. Frost thickened on the wooden roofs, and the lanterns, no longer festive, cast long, interrogative shadows. The smell of mulled wine had faded, replaced by the cold scent of damp timber and anxiety. Poirot and I were permitted to remain, at Hawthorne's discretion. The inspector had not said so outright, but it was evident that he valued Poirot's presence even while pretending not to. He questioned, Poirot listened, and sometimes, when Hawthorne paused, uncertain, Poirot supplied a quiet observation that shifted the entire direction of thought. The first to be questioned formally was the young woman from the candle stall. Eva Collins sat on a folding chair near her booth, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her candles, reds, creams, and greens, stood neatly arranged behind her, their wicks unburnt, their wax smooth and unblemished. She looked very small beside them. "You run this stall alone?" Hawthorne asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "I make them myself." "And Mr. Barrett?" Hawthorne continued. "How did you know him?" Eva hesitated. Her eyes flicked instinctively toward Poirot, then away again, as though afraid of what she might see reflected there. "He organized the market," she said. "He decided who had stalls, who didn't. Did he ever threaten you?" Hawthorne asked bluntly. The bluntness broke something in her. Her composure cracked, and words spilled out quick and breathless. "He said my prices were too low, that I was undercutting the tone of the market. He told me to raise them, or he'd give my place to someone else next year. Someone more suitable." "Suitable," Reed echoed sharply. "Someone who could contribute more generously," Eva said bitterly, "meaning him, his charities, his control." Poirot, who had been examining one of the candles with polite interest, looked up. "And did you raise your prices, Madame, Miss Collins?" "Yes," she said, flushing. "I had no choice. People complained. Sales dropped. But if I lost this stall—" She shook her head. "This is my livelihood." Hawthorne made a note. "Were you near the mulled wine stall when Mr. Barrett collapsed?" "Yes," she said softly. "I was helping at the almond stall for a few minutes. We sometimes help one another." Poirot's gaze sharpened at once, though his voice remained mild. "You were handling sugared almonds?" Eva nodded. "Yes, and candles," Poirot added, almost conversationally. Her eyes lifted to his, startled. "Yes, of course." Hawthorne watched the exchange closely. "Did you speak to Mr. Barrett tonight?" "Yes," Eva admitted. "Earlier, he warned me again. Said next year would be different." "Did you touch his mug?" Reed demanded. "No," she said sharply, then bit her lip. "I mean, no, sir, I didn't go near it." She was dismissed for the moment, though not released. As she returned to her stall, I saw her hands trembling openly now. "She had motive," I murmured. "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but motive is common. Precision is rare." The second interview took place near the bakery stall, where the scent of bread lingered faintly despite the cold. Thomas Reed, the baker, no relation to the inspector, was a large man with flour permanently embedded in the creases of his skin. His eyes were red, rimmed, not only from cold. "He was going to ruin us?" Reed said bluntly, when Hawthorne asked about Barrett. "How?" Hawthorne prompted. "He wanted to bring in traders from the city, bigger outfits, said it would raise standards." Reed's mouth twisted, meaning they'd pay him more, push us locals out. "Did he say this openly?" Hawthorne asked. "To me?" "Yes, to others. Probably not." Reed snorted. "He liked to sound generous in public." Poirot interjected gently. "And you objected?" "Of course I objected," Reed snapped. "This market was ours, built by locals. He took it over and called it charity." "Were you angry enough to kill him?" Reed asked flatly. The baker stared at him. "I bake bread," he said. "I don't poison people." "Anger takes many forms," Poirot said quietly. Reed's shoulders slumped. "I hated him," he admitted. "But I didn't plan his death. I thought." He stopped himself. "Thought what?" Hawthorne pressed. "That one day he'd push too far, that the town would turn on him." Reed shook his head. "I never thought it'd end like this." When Reed was sent back, Hawthorne exhaled slowly. "Resentment everywhere," he muttered, "but nothing specific." "Nothing yet," Poirot corrected. The third interview was, in many ways, the most revealing. Oliver Kent, the market manager, was a neat man with carefully combed hair and a nervous habit of smoothing his cuffs. He had been responsible for logistics, schedules, and, most importantly, the accounts. Kent sat stiffly, eyes darting toward the constables as though calculating his chances of escape. "Mr. Kent," Hawthorne began, "you worked closely with Barrett." "Yes, very closely," Kent said. "And recently." Kent swallowed. He was reviewing things. "What things?" Reed demanded. "The accounts," Kent admitted. "Donations, stall fees, expenses." Poirot's gaze fixed on him, and what did he find? Kent's mouth opened, then closed again. "Finally," he said. "He said there were discrepancies." "Discrepancies," Hawthorne repeated. "He accused me of skimming," Kent said in a rush. "Said if I didn't correct matters, he'd make it public, ruin me." "Were you skimming?" Reed asked. Kent's face flushed. "Aye, some rounding, nothing serious. Everyone does it." Poirot tilted his head. "Everyone does not, Mr. Kent, but many tell themselves so." Kent clenched his fists. "He was going to destroy me. He enjoyed it." "And tonight?" Hawthorne asked. "He told me after the market he'd decide whether to expose me." Kent laughed weakly. "I suppose he decided something else." "Where were you at 8 o'clock?" Hawthorne asked. "Near the tree, coordinating the choir." Poirot said nothing, but I noticed how his eyes moved. Tree, wine stall, almond stall, mapping distances, lines of sight. Moments when Kent was dismissed. Hawthorne rubbed his temples. "3 motives," he said. "Greed, fear, revenge." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "And yet none sufficient alone." Reed scowled. "Someone poisoned his drink. That's sufficient." Poirot shook his head. "Number someone planned. They knew his habits, his route, his timing. They handled sugar and wax. They wanted the death to look indulgent, not violent." Hawthorne straightened. "Meaning." "Meaning," Poirot said softly. "That this was not done in rage. Rage is messy. This was careful." He glanced toward the stalls again, too careful for one frightened merchant acting alone. A silence fell among us, broken only by the creak of wood in the cold. "You think more than one person knew?" Hawthorne asked. "I think," Poirot replied, "that many people wished him gone, and that one of them knew how to use that wish." I looked back at the vendors. Eva Collins standing rigid beside her candles, Thomas Reed staring at the ground, Oliver Kent wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Each had reason to hate Lionel Barrett, but as Poirot had said, hatred alone did not explain precision. Somewhere in Alderwick Square, among merchants bound by fear and resentment, was a mind that had not merely wished for Barrett's fall, but had designed it, and that mind, Poirot knew, would not remain silent for long. Chapter 5. Fay. A walk behind the stalls when the first fury of questioning had subsided, and the vendors had been herded into uneasy waiting. Poirot asked Inspector Hawthorne for permission to walk behind the market stalls. "Behind them?" Hawthorne repeated, surprised. "There's nothing there but snow and rubbish." Poirot smiled faintly. "Often, Inspector, that is where the most interesting things hide." Hawthorne studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but take a constable." Poirot declined this politely. "I walk better alone," he said, "and I do not intend to wander far." We slipped away from the lantern, lit square into the narrow service lanes that ran behind the stalls, like the backstage corridors of a theater. Here the charm of the market vanished entirely. There were no wreaths, no lights, no singing children, only stacked crates, overturned carts, coils of rope, and bins crusted with ice. Snow lay thick and uneven, trampled in places, pristine in others. The air was colder here, sharper, as though untouched by human warmth. Poirot paused almost at once, surveying the scene with the air of a general inspecting terrain. "You see, Hastings," he said, "a murder rarely belongs only to the place where the body falls. It belongs to the places where the murderer prepared." We walked slowly. Poirot's gaze was lowered, attentive to the ground. Mine followed suit, though I confess I saw little beyond footprints crossing one another in a meaningless tangle. "These lanes," Poirot continued, "are known only to those who work the market, not to the customers, not to the choir, not to the casual stroller." "So the murderer was a vendor?" I asked. "Or someone who wished to appear one," Poirot replied. We passed behind the candle stall. From this side, Eva Collins's neat display gave way to a rougher reality. Wooden boxes stained with wax, torn paper, a small handcart with one wheel slightly warped. Snow had drifted against the base of the stall, forming a shallow bank. Poirot stopped. "There," he said softly. At first I saw only splintered glass half, buried in snow. Then Poirot bent, brushed away the powdery surface with his gloved hand, and lifted the remains of a jar. It was broken cleanly, as though dropped rather than smashed in anger. The label, still partly intact, showed a faded illustration of striped sweets. "A candy jar," I said. "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but look closer." He tilted the jagged base toward the light spilling faintly from the square. Inside clung a residue, white, chalky, and uneven. "Sugar," I ventured. Poirot shook his head. "Number sugar crystals sparkle. This is dull, powdered, and it clings too readily." He dipped a fingertip, rubbed it between finger and thumb, then sniffed. "This does not belong to sweets," he said quietly. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter ran through me. Poison, perhaps, or something used to carry poison. He replaced the jar carefully on the snow. "What matters is not only what it is, but where it is." "Behind Eva Collins's stall," I said. "Yes, the same Eva Collins who handles candles, wax, sugar, and who was helping at the almond stall." Poirot straightened. "She has opportunity." "But you don't think she did it?" I said. Poirot smiled faintly. "I think she is frightened, and frightened people leave traces." We moved on a few steps farther. Poirot halted again. "Footprints," he said. I looked. This time I saw them clearly. A set of prints leading away from the candle stall, deeper than most, as though made by someone carrying weight or hurrying. They ran along the lane toward the rear of the market office, a small brick building used for storage and paperwork. Poirot followed them slowly, counting steps, noting spacing. "Purposeful," he murmured, "not wandering." The tracks ended abruptly near the office door, or rather, they should have continued, but did not. Beyond that point, the snow was oddly smooth, swept. "Someone cleared this," I said. "Yes," Poirot replied. "And recently, after the snowfall, after these prints were made." "Why bother?" I asked. "Because," Poirot said, "someone wanted to be seen walking here, but not followed beyond this point." He examined the office door. It was locked now, a constable posted not far away, but Poirot's eyes lingered on the threshold. The handle, the narrow window clouded with frost. "Who has access to this office?" I asked. "Oliver Kent," Poirot said at once, "and Barrett himself." "And now Barrett is dead," I said slowly. Poirot nodded. "And Kent feared exposure. Yet fear alone does not teach one how to poison discreetly." We walked a little farther, then turned back toward the square. The noise reached us before the light, the murmur of voices, the scrape of boots, the distant bark of orders. Poirot stopped once more, looking back along the lane. "Observe the pattern, Hastings," he said. "A broken jar, hidden but not buried. footprints that wish to be noticed, snow swept where it should not be. All this suggests not panic, but design. Design to what end? To suggest activity, Poirot replied. Industry. A person working late, tidying, preparing, a harmless explanation for being here. And hiding something more serious, I said, understanding dawning. Poirot's eyes met mine. Precisely. We returned to the square. The lanterns seemed harsher now, their light too bright against the darkness beyond. People glanced at us as we emerged, as though wondering what secrets the shadows might have revealed. Poirot rejoined Inspector Hawthorne and spoke quietly, relaying what we had found. Hawthorne listened without interruption, his expression grave. So, Hawthorne said at last. Summoning prepared the poison behind the stalls, carried it forward, added it to the mug, and erased their trail. Yes, Poirot agreed, and wished to be seen doing something ordinary all the while. Hawthorne exhaled slowly. Then this wasn't an impulsive act. No, said Poirot. It was rehearsed. As we stood there, I could not help but look again at the vendors, at Eva Collins with her pale face and trembling hands, at Oliver Kent smoothing his cuffs, at Thomas Reed staring into the snow. Somewhere among them was the person who had walked those narrow lanes, broken that jar, swept away their tracks, and then stepped into the light to watch a man die. And Poirot, I knew, had just followed them halfway there. Chapter 6 Fay, the market office ledger. The market office stood at the edge of Alderwick Square, like an afterthought, practical, unadorned, and faintly apologetic beside the cheerfully decorated stalls. Its brick walls were dark with damp, and a narrow window glowed weakly with lamplight. A constable unlocked the door at Inspector Hawthorne's instruction, and Poirot and I were admitted into a room that smelled of paper, dust, and cold ink. Here, stripped of lanterns and ribbons, the machinery of charity revealed itself. A small iron stove squatted in one corner, long since gone cold. A desk stood beneath the window, cluttered with ledgers, loose receipts, and a wooden tray of correspondence. On the wall hung a chalkboard listing schedules and duties, its writing half smudged, as though amended repeatedly by an anxious hand. Poirot removed his hat and gloves with deliberate care, as though entering not merely a room, but a state of mind. This, he said softly, is where truth becomes arithmetic. Inspector Hawthorne closed the door behind us. These are the books Barrett was reviewing, he said, indicating a stack of ledgers on the desk. Kent kept them. Barrett demanded to see them this week. Poirot approached the desk, his eyes already moving, cataloguing. He lifted the top ledger and weighed it slightly, as though judging its honesty by its heft. "May I?" he asked. Hawthorne gestured assent. Poirot opened the book. The handwriting was neat, regular, and impersonal, the sort of script that belongs to figures rather than people. Dates marched down the page in orderly columns: stall fees, donations, expenses. At first glance, everything appeared precisely as one would expect from a well-run market. Poirot's finger traced a line slowly. "Appearances," he murmured, "are very comforting." He turned several pages at once, riffling them gently. Then he stopped. "Here," he said. Hawthorne leaned in. So did I. The figures on this page differed subtly from those before it. The stall fees were higher, only by a little, but consistently so. A few lines farther down, a donation was recorded as received, but not accounted for elsewhere. "Inflated," Hawthorne said, "and these amounts, small individually, but over time, they accumulate." Poirot finished. "Yes." He turned another page, and another. The pattern repeated: slight increases, missing transfers, funds that vanished between receipt and disbursement, not clumsy theft, but careful siphoning. Poirot's eyes sharpened further. "Now look here." He pointed to the margin. "At first I thought it was nothing more than a note, an adjustment perhaps. Then I noticed the handwriting. It was different. The main entries were written with fluid speed. The marginal notes, however, were slower, more deliberate. Each letter was carefully formed, as though the writer had been conscious of every stroke. "Oliver Kent," Hawthorne said quietly. Yes, Poirot agreed. The hand of the man who fears mistakes. He studied the marginalia more closely. Some notes attempted to justify discrepancies, corrected, rounded, adjusted for costs. Others were terse reminders. Review, clarify, discuss with Lionel Barrett, I said. Poirot nodded. These are the notes of a man who knows he is being watched. Hawthorne straightened. Kent admits to skimming. These books would have ruined him. They would have ruined him publicly, Poirot corrected. Which is worse. Then we have our motive, Reed said from the doorway, having slipped in unnoticed. Fear of exposure. Poirot did not look up. We have a motive, he said, not the motive. Reed frowned. He was auditing Kent, threatening him. Then he dies. It fits. Poirot closed the ledger gently. It fits like a coat borrowed in haste. It covers the body, but it does not belong to the man. Hawthorne folded his arms. Explain. Poirot turned to face them. His expression was thoughtful, not triumphant. Greed and fear make men careless, he said. They rush. They seize opportunity. They make mistakes. But this death was timed. Timed how? Reed demanded. At 8 o'clock, Poirot said, at the public toast in full view, with a drink chosen for appearance as much as taste. He gestured toward the ledger. Kent is a man of numbers. He steals in small amounts. He justifies. He leaves notes. Do you think such a man suddenly decides to commit a murder that requires knowledge of poison, of dosage, of sensory disguise, and to do it before an entire town? Reed hesitated. Desperation. Yes, Poirot said softly. Desperation makes men sloppy. This was not sloppy. Hawthorne considered this. Then Kent may have known, but not acted. Precisely, Poirot said. He is a man with reason to wish Barrett silent, but wishing is not the same as planning. Poirot returned to the desk, scanning the remaining papers. Among them lay a single folded sheet, its edges worn from handling. He opened it. This, he said, is interesting. It was a list. Names of vendors, stall numbers, amounts pledged to charity. Some names were circled. Others marked with small, sharp ticks. Poirot's finger paused on one name. Eva Collins, he said. Hawthorne frowned. The candle. Maker. Yes. And here, Thomas Reed, and here, several others. Poirot looked up. Barrett was not only auditing accounts, he was consolidating power. You mean, I said slowly, he was planning to squeeze them all? Yes, Poirot replied. By money, by fear, by replacement. Reed swore under his breath. So half the market hated him. Hatred, Poirot said, is not unusual. What is unusual is coordination. He closed the list and returned it to the desk. Then he glanced at the window, where frost traced delicate patterns against the glass. Tell me, Inspector Hawthorne, he said. At what time did Mr. Barrett arrive at the market tonight? Before 6, Hawthorne replied. He made a round of the stalls. And when did he first speak of reviewing these books? Poirot asked. Earlier in the week, Hawthorne said. He told Kent he would decide after the market whether to go public. Poirot nodded. So the killer knew two things, that Barrett would be here tonight, and that he intended to make decisions that would harm others. Reed crossed his arms again. That still points to Kent. Poirot shook his head gently. Kent had time pressure, but not theatrical instinct. He moved to the chalkboard and examined the writing there. Names, times, notes about deliveries. Who wrote this? He asked. Kent, Hawthorne said, mostly. Poirot nodded. Orderly, practical, no flourishes. He turned back to the ledger. Now compare this to the smear of wax on the mug, to the sugar crystals on the glove, to the broken jar behind the stalls. Reed frowned. You're saying Kent wouldn't get his hands dirty? I am saying, Poirot replied, that Kent's crime is quiet. It hides in columns and margins. It does not announce itself with a public death. A silence fell in the small office, broken only by the faint sound of voices drifting in from the square. Hawthorne spoke at last. Then who benefits most from Barrett's death? Poirot's eyes lifted. Those who feared him, those who resented him, those who were being pushed aside. That's nearly everyone, Reed said. Yes, Poirot agreed, which is why the answer lies not in motive alone, but in method. He gestured toward the ledger once more. Barrett was auditing. He was about to accuse. Someone knew this. Someone knew the town would accept his death as excess drink, cold, indulgence. Someone chose that moment. And Kent? Hawthorne asked. Kent may have known, Poirot said. He may even have been manipulated, but greed alone rarely chooses such perfect timing. Poirot closed the ledger and replaced it carefully. This murder, he said quietly, was not committed to stop an audit. It was committed to end a reign. Outside, the market murmured. Vendors waiting, constables pacing, the town holding its breath. Poirot replaced his gloves, his expression grave. And a reign, he added, is ended not by one frightened thief, but by someone who has waited a long time to strike. Chapter 7. Fay the candles that dripped red when Poirot announced that he wished to return to Eva Collins's stall. Inspector Hawthorne raised an eyebrow but offered no objection. By now the market had settled into a tense stillness. Vendors waited under guard. The square lay half-lit and hollow, like a theatre after the curtain has fallen. But before the audience has gone, Eva stood exactly where we had last seen her, as though movement itself had become dangerous. Her candles burned low now, their flames steady and quiet, throwing soft halos of light across the frost. Dulled wood, Poirot approached the stall with the courtesy of a customer, rather than the suspicion of an investigator. He examined the candles closely, lifting one, then another, his eyes attentive to texture, color, and scent. These, he said gently, are very fine work. Eva nodded, swallowing. Thank you. Poirot selected a deep red candle, its wax glossy and smooth. This one, may I? Yes, of course. He turned it slowly beneath the lantern light. You make these yourself? All of them, and this scent? Poirot asked. It is not sweet. Eva hesitated, then nodded. Bitter orange, I use it for the red ones. People like it in winter. It cuts through heavier smells. Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. Bitter orange, he repeated. Not almonds. No, Eva said quickly. Never almonds. I dislike it. Poirot inhaled again carefully. Sharp, clean, and strong. He set the candle down and withdrew his handkerchief. From within it, carefully wrapped, he produced a small object, the handle of Barrett's mug, preserved since its removal. Eva's breath caught when she saw it. Poirot held it near the candle flame, not close enough to heat, but close enough for scent to mingle. You see, he said quietly, this smear of red wax. At first glance, it appears incidental, a careless touch. Eva stared at it, her face pale. I don't remember touching his mug. I do not believe you did, Poirot said calmly. Her eyes flew to his. You don't? No, he said. Because this wax is not random. It is deliberate. Hawthorne leaned closer. Deliberate how? Poirot gestured toward the candle. The wax carries the scent of bitter orange, strong enough to mask other smells, particularly those one might notice in a drink. Poison, Hawthorne said. Yes, Poirot replied. Specifically, one that might otherwise betray itself. Eva's hands began to tremble openly now. You think? Simone used my candles. Yes, Poirot said, but not you. She sagged slightly, as though those words alone were holding her upright. Poirot continued, his tone measured and kind. Simone prepared the mug near your stall, near wax, near sugar, near strong scent. Someone allowed a little wax to smear the handle, not caring because it helped them. And when the mug was raised, the bitter orange masked what should not have been there. Hawthorne's jaw tightened, so the poison was added near this stall. Yes, Poirot said. Briefly, efficiently. Eva shook her head helplessly. But I was helping at the almond stall. I wasn't. I know. Poirot said gently. And your hands? He paused, watching them tremble. They shake with fear, not calculation. She let out a small, broken sound, half sob, half breath. I hated him, she whispered. I did. He humiliated me, threatened me. But I couldn't. She shook her head violently. I couldn't do that. Poirot nodded. Hatred does not always lead to murder. Sometimes it leads only to silence. He glanced around the stall, noting the arrangement of candles, the spacing, the narrow gap between stalls. Who else comes here? He asked. Eva looked up slowly. The market manager checks displays. Vendors pass through, Mr. Barrett himself. He stopped here earlier. Poirot's eyes sharpened. He did. Yes. He picked one up. This one. She indicated the red candle. Said it was tasteful. Poirot absorbed this. And did anyone remain after you left to help at the almond stall? Eva frowned. I think Mr. Kent passed through. Checking schedules. Hawthorne stiffened. Kent. Yes. He said he was tidying paperwork. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. He turned back to Eva. You are frightened, he said, not because you are guilty, but because you know how many people wished him gone. She nodded miserably. Poirot replaced the mug handle into his handkerchief and stepped back. These candles, he said quietly, did not kill Lionel Barrett, but they helped his killer hide the truth. Eva looked up at him, eyes wide. Then you know who did it. Poirot met her gaze steadily. I know who did not. That, for the moment, was enough. As we stepped away, Poirot paused once more, inhaling the mingled scents of wax, spice, and cold air. The murderer, he said softly to me, is someone who understands appearances, who uses other people's labor, other people's resentment, other people's fear as cover. And Eva? I asked. Poirot glanced back at her trembling figure, lit by the gentle glow of her own candles. She is a victim, he said, just not the one who died. The red candles burned on, their wax dripping slowly, silently, like time itself, measuring the distance between suspicion and truth. Chapter 8. Fay, a sweet disguised the bakery stall, stood at the far edge of the square. Its front, now dim and abandoned, its warmth long since leached away by the night, where earlier there had been trays of rolls and small loaves steaming faintly in the cold. There were now only covered baskets and the dull scent of flour and yeast clinging stubbornly to the wood. Thomas Reed waited beside it, arms folded, shoulders hunched as though bracing himself against more than the weather. He looked less like an angry man now than a tired one, a man who had fought too many small battles and lost more than he would admit. Poirot approached him with his usual courtesy. Mr. Reed, he said, you bake with care, it shows. Reed snorted softly. Care doesn't pay debts. No, Poirot agreed, but it leaves traces. At Hawthorne's direction, Reed unlocked the small storage crate behind his stall. Inside were sacks of flour, tins of spices, jars of sugar, and a wooden box marked sweetener. Poirot's eyes went to it at once. This, he said lightly, is interesting. Reed stiffened. It's nothing but powdered sweetener, cheaper than sugar. I use it in pastries. Poirot lifted the lid. Inside was a fine white powder, compacted slightly from use. He dipped the tip of a spoon, rubbed the grains between his fingers, then sniffed. Sweet, he said, but not only sweet. Hawthorne leaned in. What do you smell? Bitter, Poirot replied. Very faint, hidden. Reed's face flushed. I don't know what you mean. Poirot looked at him steadily. Crushed kernels, he said. Stone fruit, perhaps, something that does not belong in baking sweetener. Reed's jaw tightened. That's madness. Poirot did not argue. He merely nodded to Hawthorne, who gestured for the doctor to step closer. The doctor examined the powder carefully, his brow furrowing. "There are fragments here," he said slowly. "Very small. If crushed finely enough. Yes, they could release something dangerous." Reed's voice came out hoarse. "I didn't poison anyone." Poirot turned to him gently. "Tell us about your debts." Reed flinched. Barrett knew. Somehow he always knew. He said if I didn't cooperate, raise prices, contribute more, he'd make sure suppliers heard, that banks heard. "And you were angry," Hawthorne said. "Yes," Reed said fiercely. "I was angry, but I'm not clever enough for this. I don't know about poisons. I bake bread." Poirot studied him carefully. The man's hands were large, scarred, dusted permanently with flour. They were shaking now, but not with calculation, with fear and exhaustion. "This sweetener," Poirot said, "was not meant for pastries." Reed stared at it, baffled. "Then how did it?" Poirot held up a hand. "Listen carefully, Mr. Reed. Someone needed sugar. Sugar is innocent. Sugar belongs in a market. Sugar dissolves quickly in hot wine." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "You're saying—" "Yes," Poirot replied. "The poison was mixed with sugar, not brewed, not poured, sprinkled." Reed looked up sharply. "Sprinkled." "Moments before the toast," Poirot continued, "when attention was on Barrett, when no one was watching the mug, only the man." Hawthorne frowned. "That would require exact timing." "And exact placement," Poirot said. "Only someone who knew precisely where Barrett would stand, which stall, which moment, which mug." Reed shook his head. "I didn't go near him at 8. I was serving bread." "I believe you," Poirot said simply. Reed sagged, relief and despair mingling on his face. Poirot stepped back, his mind clearly arranging pieces into alignment. "Sugar," he murmured. "Wax, bitter orange, almonds. All things that belong in a market. All things that disguise." Hawthorne folded his arms. Then the killer needed access to sweetener, scent, and proximity. He looked across the square, to where the mulled wine stalls stood silent beneath the lanterns. "Barrett chose that spot deliberately," Poirot said. "But someone else knew he would." "And that someone," Hawthorne said slowly, "could move freely between stalls." Poirot's eyes lifted toward the market office, its dark window reflecting faint light. "Someone who was meant to be everywhere," he said, "and therefore noticed nowhere." A silence settled between us, heavy with understanding. Only someone who knew exactly where Lionel Barrett would stand, exactly when the toast would be made, could have added a fatal sweetness in full view, and vanished without alarm. And that knowledge, Poirot knew now, narrowed the circle sharply indeed. Chapter 9. Fay Poirot speaks in the town hall. The town hall of Alderwick was not often used in winter. Its high ceiling trapped the cold, and the stone walls held it like a memory. On this night, the lamps burned low and steady, throwing long shadows across rows of wooden chairs arranged with hurried formality. Outside, the market bells, forgotten in the confusion, still rang faintly as the wind nudged them, a thin, irregular sound that crept in through the shutters, like a reminder of unfinished business. They were all there. Eva Collins sat with her hands folded tightly, her face pale but composed. Thomas Reed occupied a chair near the aisle, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. Oliver Kent sat straighter than the rest, back rigid, hands resting neatly on his knees, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Barrett sat apart, wrapped in a dark shawl, her gaze unfocused, as though she were present only in body. Inspector Hawthorne stood near the front, arms crossed, his expression guarded. Inspector Reed hovered nearby, restless, clearly uncomfortable with the notion of waiting. Poirot stood alone at the center. He had chosen his place deliberately, not behind a desk, not elevated, but where all could see him equally. He looked smaller than usual beneath the vast ceiling, yet there was nothing diminished about his presence. When he spoke, his voice carried easily, calm and precise, and the room quieted at once. "Mesdames and messieurs," Poirot began, then corrected himself smoothly. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I regret the cold, and I regret far more the reason we are here." No one spoke. "We have suffered a death that was sudden, public, and shocking," Poirot continued. "And because it was public, many of you believed it would remain simple. A man drinks too much in winter. A heart fails. A tragedy. Yes, but an accident." He paused, letting the word settle. It was not an accident. A murmur ran through the room, quickly stilled by Hawthorne's raised hand. "Mr. Barrett was murdered," Poirot said quietly, "and he was murdered with care." Oliver Kent shifted almost imperceptibly, then stilled himself again. Poirot turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the assembled faces. "Many of you had reason to resent Lionel Barrett," he said. "He controlled your livelihoods. He raised fees, he threatened exposure. He spoke of replacing local vendors with outsiders. Fear, anger, humiliation. These were his tools." Eva's jaw tightened. Thomas Reed clenched his hands. "And so," Poirot continued, "it was easy to believe that any one of you might have struck out in rage. But rage is clumsy. Rage shouts. Rage leaves fingerprints." He lifted a finger gently. "This murder whispered." Poirot began to walk slowly as he spoke, not pacing, but moving with intention. The poison was not poured into a barrel. That would have risked others. It was added to one mug only, Mr. Barrett's, and it was added moments before he raised it to toast the town. Inspector Reed frowned. "In full view." "In full view," Poirot agreed. "Because no one was watching the mug, they were watching the man." He turned toward Eva Collins. "Miss Collins," he said gently, "your candles provided the scent of bitter orange. Strong, clean, capable of masking what should not be there. Wax from one of them smeared the handle of the mug, not by accident, but by proximity." Eva swallowed, but Poirot held up a hand. "You did not do this," he said firmly. "Your fear is honest. It shakes the hands." He turned next to Thomas Reed. "Mr. Reed, your baking supplies contained powdered sweetener, sugar suitable for disguising a poison when dissolved in hot wine. Crushed kernels were found within it." Thomas Reed looked up sharply. "I told you." "I didn't. And I believe you," Poirot said, "because you did not know they were there." A stir of surprise ran through the room. Poirot's gaze shifted at last to Oliver Kent. "Mr. Kent," he said calmly, "you were the market manager." Kent inclined his head slightly. "Yes, you controlled the schedules," Poirot continued. "You knew where Mr. Barrett would stand when he would speak, which stall he would choose." Kent's expression did not change. "You controlled the accounts," Poirot said. "And when Mr. Barrett began to audit them, you altered figures. You made notes in your own careful hand. You feared exposure." Kent's lips tightened. "And you controlled access," Poirot went on, "to the market office, to the stalls after closing, to the lanes behind them where a jar was broken and footprints were swept away." Kent's fingers twitched once, then stilled. Poirot stopped walking. He stood directly before Kent now, though not so close as to threaten, only close enough that the truth felt unavoidable. "You wish to be seen working late," Poirot said softly. "Tidying, preparing, doing your duty, while hiding something far more serious." Kent laughed. A short, brittle sound. "This is conjecture." Poirot nodded. "Then let us remove conjecture." He turned to Inspector Hawthorne. "Inspector, the ledgers." Hawthorne gestured, and a constable brought forward the account books. Poirot opened them deliberately, turning to the altered pages. "These figures were inflated," Poirot said. "These funds missing, and here," he tapped the margin lightly. "Your handwriting, Mr. Kent, careful, deliberate, afraid." Kent stood abruptly. "I admitted to skimming," he said sharply. "That's not murder." "No," Poirot agreed. "But it explains why you were desperate." Kent's voice rose. "Desperate men don't plan theatrical deaths." "Precisely," Poirot said. The word cut through the room. You are not desperate by nature, Poirot continued. You are orderly, you plan, you calculate. And when you realized Mr. Barrett intended not merely to accuse you, but to replace half the market and consolidate his control, you saw an opportunity. Kent's breathing quickened. You knew, Poirot said, that if he died publicly, while drinking, the town would accept indulgence as explanation, and if suspicion did arise, it would fall first on those he had mistreated. Eva stiffened. Thomas Reed looked up slowly. You used their resentment as camouflage, Poirot said. Their fear as cover, their tools as disguise. Kent shook his head violently. You can't prove I touched the mug. Poirot smiled sadly. Number, but I can prove you arranged everything around it. He gestured broadly. You ensured the sugar was available. You knew the candle's scent. You positioned yourself where you could sprinkle, not pour, the poison into the mug as you passed, and then you stepped back into the crowd to watch. Kent's composure finally fractured. You're guessing. Poirot's voice remained calm. Then explain why the footprints behind the stalls led to your office, and vanished where snow had been swept. Explain why the poison appeared only where you had reason and access. Explain why every element of this crime, timing, placement, disguise, required someone who knew the market as a system. Kent's face had gone grey. You did not kill Barrett in anger, Poirot said quietly. You killed him because he was about to end your control. Silence fell. Then, very slowly, Oliver Kent's shoulders sagged. His careful posture collapsed inward, like a structure whose supports had finally been removed. I didn't mean for it to be like that, he whispered. Inspector Hawthorne stepped forward at once, but Poirot raised a hand gently. You meant for it to be quiet, Poirot said. You meant for it to look like nothing. Kent laughed weakly, tears standing in his eyes. He thought he owned us. He thought charity made him untouchable. Poirot regarded him with grave compassion. Power, he said, is always touchable. That is why it fears truth. Hawthorne placed a hand on Kent's shoulder. Kent did not resist as he was led away. The bells outside rang once more, stirred by the wind. Poirot turned back to the others. This market, he said, was built on cooperation. It was twisted by control. Mr. Barrett's death does not cleanse that, but it ends it. Mrs. Barrett bowed her head, tears finally falling. Poirot inclined his head to the room. The truth, he said softly, has been spoken. And in the cold town hall, beneath the faint echo of bells, Alderwick at last began to breathe again. Chapter 10 Fay, The Market Grows. Quiet Oliver Kent's confession, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no sudden outburst, no collapse to the floor, no cry for mercy. Instead, it unfolded with the weary inevitability of a man who has been holding a wall upright long after its foundations have failed. In a small side room of the town hall, colder even than the main chamber, Kent sat with his head bowed and his hands clasped tightly together. Inspector Hawthorne stood nearby, silent, allowing the words to come at their own pace. Poirot and I remained a little apart, observers rather than participants. Poirot had no need to press. The truth, once exposed, has a habit of continuing on its own. I never meant to steal, Kent said at last, his voice dull. Not at first. It was small, rounding figures, delaying transfers. I told myself it was temporary, that I would fix it. Poirot said nothing. Then the market grew, Kent continued. So did expectations. Barrett wanted everything larger, grander. He spoke of charity, but it was control he enjoyed. When he began auditing, Kent swallowed. I knew I was finished. You feared prison, Hawthorne said. Kent shook his head. I feared disgrace. The market was my work, my reputation. If he exposed me, everything would collapse. Vendors, donors, trust. I told myself I was protecting the market. Poirot's voice was gentle but unyielding. And so you chose to protect an image instead of the truth? Kent looked up then, eyes rimmed with red. He was going to ruin us all, he said. Not just me. He wanted to replace locals, squeeze more money, turn charity into spectacle, I thought. If he were gone, the market could survive. And you? Hawthorne asked quietly. Kent gave a hollow smile. I thought I would survive too. The details followed with grim clarity. The sweetener taken from Reed's supplies, altered gradually, so no one noticed. The poison crushed and mixed, disguised among innocent ingredients. The candle stall chosen for preparation because scent would overwhelm suspicion. The timing fixed precisely because Kent himself controlled it. I knew where he would stand, Kent said. I knew he would toast the crowd. He always did. I passed the mug as if checking arrangements. No one looks at a man doing his job. Inspector Hawthorne nodded once. They will now. When Hawthorne led Kent away, there was no resistance. Kent rose, straightened his coat out of habit, and walked between the constables with the same careful steps he had used all his working life. At the door, he hesitated, glancing back once, perhaps at the hall, perhaps at the idea of the man he had been. Then he was gone. Outside, Alderwick Square was already changing. The market, once bright with noise and colour, was being dismantled in near silence. Vendors worked methodically, hands moving without conversation. Wooden shutters closed. Lanterns were extinguished one by one, their glow shrinking into darkness. The garlands were taken down, ribbons folded away as though they had never belonged to this place at all. Eva Collins wrapped her candles carefully, her movements slow and precise. Thomas Reed lifted crates of unsold bread, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion rather than anger. No one spoke of Barrett. No one spoke of Kent. The market seemed to exhale a long-held breath. Poirot and I stood at the edge of the square, watching. It ends not with celebration, I said quietly, but with silence. Poirot nodded. Silence is honest, he replied. It allows reflection. The last lantern near the mulled wine stall flickered, then went out. The place where Lionel Barrett had fallen was now only a darker patch on the ground, already dusted with fresh snow. Mrs. Barrett passed us then, supported by a relative. She did not look at Poirot, but there was no accusation in her bearing, only grief, and the heavy knowledge that the man she had known had been both powerful and deeply feared. Poirot removed his hat as she went by. When she had gone, Hastings, the friend in me, could not help speaking. "Do you think," I asked, "that the market will recover?" Poirot considered this, perhaps, he said, if they allow it to belong to many, rather than one. We began to walk away as the square emptied. The church clock struck 9, its sound softer now, less commanding. Snow fell lightly, settling into the grooves left by carts and boots, smoothing away the day's disturbances. At the far end of the square, a child's dropped ribbon lay half, buried, its red dulled by white. Poirot paused, looking back once more at the darkened stalls. "You see, Hastings," he said, "Christmas markets sell warmth and goodwill. They are places where people believe in generosity, where they expect kindness to be genuine." "And sometimes it isn't," I said. "No," Poirot agreed. "Sometimes it is managed, calculated, displayed for effect." We turned down the quiet street leading away from the square. The lights of Alderwick dimmed behind us, window by window. "But the truth," Poirot continued, "does not care for displays. It does not require lanterns or music. It behaves more like winter." "How so?" "It finds the cracks," he said softly. "No matter how carefully one seals them, no matter how much warmth one pretends." He glanced at me, his eyes thoughtful, almost sad. "And when it enters," he added, "everything false must either harden or break." The snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, covering stains, restoring the square to something like innocence. Yet I knew, as Poirot knew, that Alderwick would never see its market in quite the same way again. The cheer would return next year, the lights would glow, the bells would ring, and so, in the quiet aftermath of murder, as the last echoes faded and the night reclaimed its own, Hercule Poirot walked on, leaving behind not comfort, but clarity, which is often the colder gift and the truer one.